All right, welcome to COVID Sound, the musical effects of a global pandemic. So my name is Jared Hunt, and my co-host is Andrea Denis. Dr. Denis and I taught together here in Texas at Coppell Independent School District for about 3 years before new opportunities presented themselves this past summer. So before we get into everything, what led us to these talking points, what we're calling COVID Sound, and more, we would like to tell you a little bit about ourselves and where we are today. So Dr. Denis, would you like to tell us a little bit about yourself first?
Sure, yeah. I am Andrea Denis, and I am currently the assistant professor of horn at Stephen F. Austin State University in Nacogdoches, Texas. That is the opportunity that presented itself. That is why I'm no longer a private horn instructor in Coppell. But previous to Stephen F. Austin State University, I taught horn or was a horn professor at Texas Women's University and, solely for Coppell ISD as well. And like most private teachers, I was required to teach at home pretty abruptly when at the beginning of March last year to the COVID-19 pandemic. And it was, a learning process with everything, how to be effective with as being an online teacher, not knowing how long we would be that way. And then obviously it turns out we were that way for more than a year until pretty much April of 2021. So, Jared?
Yeah, so really the same here. Like I said, my name is Jared Hunt. I am currently the adjunct trumpet professor at the University of Mary Hardin-Baylor in Belton, Texas. Also a new gig for me. And I'm the adjunct trumpet professor at Dallas College, the Richland campus, and still the trumpet instructor for the Coppell Independent School District. So I guess that's the only one that's not the purple school here in the list of schools. So yeah, the Dr. Denis and I were in communication a lot throughout the pandemic. We discussed our teaching, our setup, trying to help each other out, pros and cons and everything throughout. But what felt like an initial kind of Band-Aid to bridge the gap between us going home and thinking it was just going to be a week and then going back and all of that stuff, it turned out to be our full reality pretty quickly. So I think Dr. Denis is going to get us started here with kind of what led us to this topic.
Sure, yeah. So Dr. Hunt and I feel like we both adjusted actually relatively pretty quickly to at-home teaching, given all the circumstances that we had. We had to prepare our teaching spaces, getting students and parents on board with everything. But we also have to attribute a lot of it to the culture in Coppell ISD and our relative colleges and universities as well. The band and music programs were pretty limited at that point, especially early on. There was not much what they could do, virtually as a band class. And so there was a lot of emphasis put on what we did with our studio teaching. And it allowed for us to continue working with students at a very high level. Unfortunately, as great as the situation was, individual problems still began to present themselves, actually giving us better insight into the at-home situations our students were dealing with, and many who might have been dealing with those issues for some time, not just during the pandemic.
Yeah, so
Jared?
that brings us to really our overall goal today. I think we froze for just a second, but that brings us to our overall goal, which is to highlight high brass private instruction, really from the beginner to the collegiate level, because we both had a lot of those students throughout this time. During the height of the COVID-19 pandemic, major changes that occurred while teaching virtually, and some suggestions on how to best fix the continued problems that first presented themselves with the online teaching. Furthermore, we'll kind of look into our current situation as we continue to work out of the pandemic, at the very least having the majority of our studios back in person in some form or fashion, albeit in big rooms or whatnot. And then post-pandemic teaching, and how it's been modified for the betterment of the student. So I will put a caveat and say I use the term post-pandemic in reference to our students being back in person, not to belittle the situation we're still dealing with and everything, obviously, as the doctors and nurses are still trying to figure out how to end this thing. So I guess the first question is, what is COVID sound? It's a term that we've thrown around a lot in Coppell. I know that our former director of bands here and then Dr. Denis and myself, we talked about this a lot when it came to the solo contest and everything. that we've had going on in the year or so that we've tried to make continue working. But from talking with those other colleagues, many of us experienced this once we got back into seeing and hearing our students in person again, after hearing them on an iPad or with at least a little bit of audio equipment for over a year. So formerly, we might have called this, practice room sound. I know that, when I was in grad school, we often talked about practice room sound and how difficult it was when you spent so much time in a practice room going into a large ensemble, and how actually in my undergrad, I felt like I battled that better because I played in marching band, whereas, in grad school, I didn't do that. And so, I feel like it actually encompasses so much more now. I feel like COVID sound, as we've discussed, is it's a lack of confidence. It's a small sound, a weak tone, poor breathing, poor fundamentals, really kind of all put together. All of that took a hit during the pandemic. So, confidence in performing and playing in front of others, posture, breathing, endurance, practice habits, musicality, we could just keep on going through that list.
Yeah, and then reading a number of the articles about education in the pandemic, I actually came across one that is not necessarily about music, but it does offer a similar line of thought. The report published on September 10th, 2020 in the Economic Policy Institute was written by Emma Garcia and Elaine Weiss. And this is a very long title, so I apologize. But it's COVID-19 and the student performance, equity, and U.S. education policy, lessons from pre-pandemic research to inform relief, recovery, and rebuilding. Okay, so a few specific notes that kind of stuck out through that article is that they even discussed that while we do not know the exact impacts, we do know that children's academic performance is deteriorating during the pandemic, along with their progress on other developmental skills. And then they go on to say that as a consequence, many of the children who struggle the hardest to learn effectively and thrive in school under normal circumstances are now finding it difficult and even impossible in some cases to receive effective instruction, and they are experiencing interruptions in their learning that will need to be made up for. This goes on to further state that schools and teachers must anticipate the need for more personalized learning. And again, this is, going on the education and policy as a whole, but then honestly relating it to us as music educators and private lesson instructors, that personalized learning goes hand in hand. So we are already seeing and hearing the negative impacts of our students learning from home. And I'm sure, many of you guys watching this, you can relate and you see it happening, maybe even with your own students. And we hear that COVID sound happening though along with this. So while Dr. Hunt and myself have by no means experienced every learning situation over the last 17 to 18 months, we do have a high number of students, or high volume of students that we have been able to work with, honestly, from middle school all the way up through collegiate level. And so we have developed a general flow chart of some of the problems as they began and have persisted. So first, students were sent home just for a week or two. And at first, many during a spring vacation, or so they thought. This felt like an extension of vacation, and practice was hard to encourage or come by to begin. And even coming back, they just felt like it was, oh, sweet, Christmas vacation. Oh, great, another 3 weeks, and then 4 weeks. So as the time lengthened, students were relegated to practicing at home in small rooms, often with parents and siblings, roommates, doing their own Zoom work or in phone calls. Many times the students were asked to play quieter. I even had some students who had to purchase practice mutes because their parents were working from home and the sound just traveled too much. So this initial setup led to many poor practice routines, coupled with a lack of band orchestra rehearsals, daily reinforcement by the teachers and peers. And eventually we noticed a change in their confidence, possibly stemming from weakened practice routines, less playing in general, zero opportunities really to perform at that point, and kind of the want to perform. As it went along, they always had a setup for a screen, so slouching in desk chairs or on the sides of couches and beds, My favorite was the horn posture, just sitting with their cross-legged on the bed and the horns just kind of sitting in their lap. It's, and you can comment all you want, but you just see it happening, and that's how they're practicing at home too. So, everything, poor posture, poor breathing, everything that leads basically to less musicality, less endurance, poor articulation strength, it all begins to set in, and the students are starting or began to see kind of their playing ability decline. Obviously, we're describing some of the worst case scenarios. There are, definitely some shining stars, some students who excelled during this time. But, we're thinking the majority of the students. As these early struggles began to be seen, we realized that online lessons were probably going to continue into the fall, and we hoped they were going to be done. And we kept, Dr. Hunt and I just kept talking and talking about, hey, maybe we'll be back, maybe we'll be back, and then it just kept moving. And in Coppell, we weren't back until April. So it was no longer just survival mode at this point. But at the very least, we found that some of the teaching opportunities actually presented themselves for the better out of going forward from this. So first we'll talk about technology, events, and group ideas, and then round out with some actual applicable practice ideas and routines.
Yeah, that's great. I try really hard not to believe that that's how our students have been practicing for the last 10 years, with the trumpet balanced in one hand and scrolling through music with the left hand and and all of that. But at the very least, this kind of gave us insight into some of their at-home routines. And I know that that my students and I have had that conversation, and obviously saying, of course, you've never done this before. This was only brought on through this. So, but yeah, so we like Dr. Denis said, we've discussed many positive ideas and strategies that we've seen others implement or even tried ourselves. A couple of these are. So we wanted to highlight a few of those. So give me just a second to kind of go through a couple. I think I have three specific ones. The first I thought was a really inventive use of technology and virtual learning. I don't know if you and I even discussed this much before the other day, so I hope you like this idea too. But I thought it was really cool that at Oklahoma State University this past summer, the assistant professor of trumpet there, Dr. Joseph Cooper, he held a virtual trumpet workshop to give orchestral mock audition experience, but not only as a player, but also as a judge. And he titled this "The Other Side Understood." I had a couple students that participated, gave rave reviews about it. But to give a brief explanation of kind of the process is, the students were given a standard audition list about 2 weeks before a specific date, which was the technical beginning of the workshop. And then on that date, 2 weeks later, an order of excerpts was given at 8 a.m. They had basically 13 hours to come up with an unedited single take audio recording of that order. Encouraged obviously to do it just one time, not to sit there and do a bunch of single takes through to simulate an audition. So all recordings were then made anonymous into a Google Drive, and each participant plus Dr. Cooper and 2 guest judges, they had another assistant professor and a principal trumpet in a major symphony orchestra, listen and evaluate using a specific rubric. So every student who was participating plus the guest judges all got to judge, and they got to rate how they felt their peers were doing and everything, not knowing who anyone was. The students received feedback, evaluation, and an informative masterclass at the end of the week with Dr. Cooper and those guest judges. It was a really good situation, and it accommodated a wide range of students, from I think the youngest being juniors or seniors in high school all the way through graduate students who are going for that next step, and then also a high range of financial backgrounds, because they made it really affordable for students all over the country to be able to do this and not have to pay travel costs or anything like that. So I do know at the very end, I reached out to Dr. Cooper to ask about this a little bit, but he said that students were asked to submit an anonymous evaluation at the end of it all, and the feedback was really, really positive. I think that through all the different categories that they rated 1 to 10, their average was well over 9 out of 10. It was just really, really well received. He did discuss that they would like to try and do an in-person version of this in the future, but maybe even still incorporate some form of virtual going forward. So I thought that was one. Another one is, yeah, really, really cool opportunity there. Another one that I have to say, because it's important to me, is chamber music's back. You know, not that it was gone, but I feel like sometimes, and maybe it's the scenario that I'm in personally, but sometimes it feels like chamber music kind of gets left on the back burner. You know, I remember the first time I wrote, you know, my philosophy of teaching, and then as I've continued to edit that going forward, that I talk about 3 tiers of music education. I think that it's really important to have large ensemble. I think it's really important to have private and solo instruction. But I think chamber music really bridges that gap. It teaches you how to play with like instruments. It teaches you how to learn the sound of your own instrument and other versions of that, intonation, how to play without a conductor. I mean, we could go on and on about what chamber music does for us as players, but you know, it was to encourage social distancing during, you know, the really as colleges started to go back to campus some last fall and into the spring. You know, many colleges, universities, and high schools initiated chamber music concerts and recitals. We had one here at Coppell in May as well. So during, you know, the height of the pandemic, this really was one of the few outlets where students were actually able to get together, you know. And so after being at home for so long in their own versions of quarantine, they were able to get together, play, even if it was with bell covers or whatever, super spaced out outside in a rotunda practicing, they were able to do that. And then even some competitions that I saw change their rules for a year to encourage versions of this, whether it be recording individuals and putting it together in some format, you know, using lots of different apps for that, or you know, just recording in person spread out. But the National Trumpet Competition, which, you know, I've been fortunate to play, you know, participate in with students and as a member, you know, years ago, you know, they did an all video competition this year for their ensemble. So the solo portion was able to go in person, but they did the ensembles by video. But they allowed editing this year. So normally it's, you know, you get this amount of time and you can't edit, and it's got to be one take. And in the past, you've had to show a clock so that, you know, they know exactly how much time goes by and stuff. But this was allowing editing, so it allowed for that expression of students and let kids have fun. I say kids, some of these are graduate students, so you're not a kid, but you know, they let students have fun and really go into some really good work in musicality. And some of the submissions were beautiful and masterful work. So it was really cool to see. And then the last one, and then I'll stop talking for a minute. The last one and this was one that we did more here. I say here, I'm sitting in Coppell right now. I'm drive all over the place, and Dr. Denis is in Nacogdoches right now, if I said that correctly.
Yeah.
But something that we utilized here, I think I called them Zoom study halls for trumpet or whatever instrument we were doing. But basically, we've always been, we're really thankful to have had this situation for Dr. Denis and myself to still be in it. I understand that what we have here is unique in basically having a collegiate-esque studio at the high school level. And we are entrusted to teach a lot of master classes on top of teaching a lot of private lessons and everything. And so even during the pandemic, we were having master classes, virtual master classes for region etudes and all kinds of stuff. And within those master classes, we had some of these little study halls that were like little breakout sessions that you could do, where we would, you know, kind of put students of similar abilities into separate breakout rooms and have them perform their audition repertoire for each other and discuss things. I mean, it could be wrong notes and rhythms because that's common, and or anything as far as individual microphone usage or placement, and students buying you know, different microphones to try and you know, mess with things as they were, you know, working on sounding better at home. And that kind of all led up to the fact that in Texas last year, we did have we still had region, area, and all state auditions, but the entire process was done via recording. And so these students were trying to figure out, you know, how to sound really good and not just use an iPhone, or if they did use an iPhone, maybe set up in a you know, a bigger room in their house, or the room that had tile or hardwood, or a bathroom, or whatever worked out best for them. And so without going into too much detail on that whole process, the students were given an app where they could record their audition within a 5-day period. as many takes as they wanted, but the caveat was once you recorded, that was your take. And if you recorded a second one, it deleted the previous one. So it wasn't like they could just pick and choose their favorite. It was when you started a new recording, it replaced it all. But the pressure was there, but it still allowed for redo. So good or bad, it gave the students an opportunity to still participate in that process last year. And from all I heard and understand, it went really well, to the point to where even that might be something that that some regions might consider using in the future. There's been a little bit of talk of that, and I don't think they're doing it this year, but in that phase one process to be able to do recording to go to the next in-person rounds. So.
Yeah, very much so. So I guess that's, talking about some of the goods, and the bad and everything. It was really funny when Dr. Hunt and I started talking about putting this presentation together. I was like, oh, we should just totally go Clint Eastwood and call it the good, the bad, and the ugly. Because while there's been a lot of, negative side effects to everything, there are some good things that really came out of this. Many that we utilized ourselves. And so while we, keep going on and teaching and everything, he and I both have found that we've been still utilizing a lot of the same things that we had implemented during COVID. So one of the ways was updating the way we keep up with lessons from week to week, especially in studios of our size, 50, 60, 70, maybe 80 or 90 with some of the teachers that we have here in Coppell. That, a lot of us grew up using the spiral bound notebook for lessons. And believe it or not, I actually went back to that with my college students here at SFA. I'm like, bring in your notebook, because we are so much more in person now. But I know teaching the amount of students, day to day in Coppell, and to really make sure that we had kept everybody going, that many of us went to Google Sheets or My Music Staff or some form of technology to keep the communication there. And often, oftentimes I sent it to the parents as well, so the parents could be in on it as well as the students. So everybody was on the same page. And I found that, it's something that works and stays, and we need to keep the students on top of these daily, weekly assignments. And that's a really great way to do it, since they are on their phones all the time.
Yeah. And then they have them there in their pockets, all the time.
Exactly.
Pull it out, take a look at what you've got to practice,
Right.
And actually I'll jump on that one. I presented my students this year at UMHB. I asked which they would prefer. And I gave them the option. I said, hey, if you want to be to have one accountability partner or accountability buddy, we can add their email address on there, and I think all of my students, all but one of them really wanted to do spiral bound, but everybody else was like, yeah, let's do it, that sounds great. And then they can yell at me and you don't have to, kind of thing. So but no, it's been really great. And that's something that I've continued here in Coppell and at Dallas College is having the Google Sheet. So especially as we go in and out of still, there are some times that we're still having to go virtual back and forth, based off of certain levels and things here. So, but at the end of the day, what we do in lessons, as we've discussed, with each other, is it's for our students and about what they need, and so, discussing this topic without, just from our end, oh, well, this worked great, so obviously we are all knowledgeable. It's not true. Discussing this topic without going to the students, it really felt super narcissistic. And so we discussed about, we posed 5 questions that we wanted to kind of send to some of our high school students, older students, and college students, really about virtual learning and our hope to meet them in the middle, learn from them, and help them succeed more. And so the 5 questions that we asked, I'll read these out. One of them was, what do you feel were things that suffered most from your time during at-home learning? One was, did you develop any positive practices or instrument habits during quarantine? If so, what? Number 3 was, what did you dislike most about virtual lessons? Number 4, what did you like the most? And then number 5, do you think that virtual private lessons can still be effective on a limited basis if needed in the future? So hopefully our slideshow is working here, trying to put those together after the fact, but hopefully they're working. But below are kind of a handful of responses from our students, just kind of summarizing. That first question, like we said, was what suffered during your at-home learning? It was kind of eye-opening and really not always noticeable from the other side of the camera. We talk about, we worked really hard to have a decent setup, have a good microphone and all that kind of stuff. But then you see what is happening on the other end, which is you flip it around, they may have a music stand. They might also just have a trumpet case or a French horn case or a trombone case that's sitting up there holding their cell phone, and they don't even have headphones plugged into it. So they're maxing out the volume. And so, some of these things were not always noticeable. But, some of the most common comments we got from things that suffered a lot were playing with an open sound, their confidence, just not playing in front of others, breathing, and motivation. All of these things that maybe we as teachers have taken for granted a little bit before, but now we can be hypersensitive to this in both virtual and in-person lessons. And I know that some of these questions, even though these questions were posed more recently, I had these conversations with students toward the middle, maybe last October, November, December, about things that were troubling them. And we talked a little bit more about their confidence. We talked about their motivation and their breathing. And so these were some things we started to get out of. And then we noticed more as we got them back in person.
Yes, especially getting them back in person. It was so eye-opening. So the second question about positive practice habits during quarantine. Some students said they practiced more. Others said they practiced less. It did seem like students gravitated more toward recording themselves and listening back. I'm not sure if in Coppell some of that was because of the all region coming up. But needless to say, we did assign recording assignments, and I'm actually still doing that at the university level. Versus, we still play in class every single week, in our studio classes, but they're actually having recording assignments because I do think it's becoming more and more prevalent with auditions and everything else.
I think back to, when I was in school or even prior to college, we just didn't have the technology. I sound so dated saying that, but we didn't have the technology. And now you can just pick up an iPhone or a lot of students that I've, worked with have found that $30 or $50, snowball microphone that you can just pop it right into the phone. And it's a relatively good recording quality and just do some good recordings.
Yeah. And what this made students really do is evaluate themselves. So even taking us out of the equation, that they could hear what we were hearing. And so, a lot of the students did respond well to recording themselves and really understanding what we're talking about. The third question was about what students disliked most about quarantine lessons. Most of it was all technology issues. Lagging, we already had that, and we've got good internet here. There were, sound problems were obviously the most common, and especially when it first began. I even had one where I didn't know that when I had my setup, it actually transposed my pitch. And so I was trying to play with students in a master class, and they were like, Dr. Denis, I'm not matching you. We're trying to play the same notes, but we aren't matching whatsoever. And it wasn't until there was a setting on the Zoom that you had to change something. And I didn't know that at that point. So, there was some of it, learning for us with the technology as well. But it just made us highlight even more why in-person is great for some of those sounds. Obviously, I wouldn't be playing a half step higher or lower than my students in lessons. And just hearing in-person tone qualities and everything else would really be a good thing.
Yeah, I knew that. I always liked my teachers to play for me. I always like to have teachers play duets with me or give examples. And I remember in when I was in grad school, when I was doing my master's, we had a class where we kind of went through different sections where you evaluated your own teaching, and you kind of went through how much did I talk, how much did the student talk, how much did I play, how much did the student play. And I remember very early on when I was 24 or 25, it was I talked this much, I played very little, the student played even less. It was like really learning how to do this thing. And And actually, I credit that to Dr. Bob Duke, or Dr. Robert Duke at the University of Texas. He had a program that was fantastic for going through that. And it was a lot of fun learning from him, and it helped me a lot realize how I taught. But I knew I always enjoyed my teachers playing, and that's something that I guess during the pandemic I didn't realize, because I thought, oh, I'm still playing for them, I'm doing stuff. But it's it's that no matter how good the setup was on my side, it was still a condensed sound that just wasn't really working up.
Yeah.
So yeah, so the last two questions were about what students liked when it came to virtual lessons, and if they thought they could be useful in the future. The latter was kind of a mixed bag. Some students really liked them, others did not at all. But it seemed that students overall agreed that in a pinch, we could use virtual lessons in the future. I've had some students, come up with a really short notice kind of thing, and we've been able to make it work. And it's not ideal, but it is a possibility in the future. We've at least had experience with that now. Though nothing will replace in-person lessons, full sound, working together and all of that. So, but the students also seem to really like how accessible lessons were. They could I hope they weren't just rolling out of bed playing a lesson, but I mean, they were accessible. It was, I remember one student said they didn't feel uncomfortable walking out of a rehearsal or something for a lesson or anything like that, even if it had been approved prior to that moment. So, but yeah, accessible and flexibility. So.
Right. So let's go ahead and talk about the bad and the ugly. Many students discussed routines or lack thereof, and we both took that on ourselves to be that positive influence for our students. A lack of motivation is not easy to overcome, and that was a lot of the students. And it's not going to happen in every case, but we found that being a source of encouragement, adding books and repertoire at a higher level, just encouraging that practice. Especially once students came back in person. That was a really big deal. Many students were actually musically hungry, and they realized where they once were, they got into larger rooms, playing in ensembles again, and they just got more excited coming back. As high brass players, their sounds, however, were somewhat weak, unsupported, all the things that we discussed as being part of that COVID sound. And a lot of the students heard it, especially getting back to in-person. They felt like they had to work especially hard to even hang in the ensembles, with volume, with endurance, and just being able to make it an entire rehearsal, especially in the high horn parts or high trumpet parts. And they're like, oh my goodness, marching band. And Dr. Hunt and I, our response every single time was go back to those basics, go back to the buzzing, go back to the breathing, just get things to happen again.
Yes, students they had stopped focusing on themselves, and their own development and their foundation. I know I had a teacher once say something to the likes of, the purpose of fundamentals is to focus, listen to yourself, and evaluate to get better. Not just to go through the motions. So one thing I did this summer was I had a daily fundamentals class every day at 1:00. It was via Zoom, so it was still utilizing technology, but it allowed students who either didn't have transportation or anything like that. It was for all levels. I mean, I had students from as young as 12 or 13 years old all the way up through 24 or 25 that were doing this, and we were just getting together and promoting the habit of listening to yourselves, focusing on sound, breathing, air support, among other fundamental techniques like finger dexterity and flexibility and all that kind of stuff. So, we used multiple routines, including the Caruso method, 6 notes, the Bill Adam routine, plus many standard books like Clark, Schlossberg, Gordon, and more like that. I did have, I held a Chick-fil-A challenge that was, I'm from Georgia originally, so I'm going to have a Chick-fil-A challenge. Yeah. It was incentive based, obviously, but it was for students just to record a short segment of them after the fact continuing. You have a 30-minute fundamental session with a group, and then the goal was always to continue for another 30 minutes or more on what you needed to do from that. It's been a long time, but I remember a story about Wynton Marsalis once where he talked about he would do 5 things every day for a minute, and if any of those wasn't good enough, he would practice each of them for an hour or something like that. And I don't remember the exact details, so forgive me. But basically, that was the encouragement: was what went wrong in our 30 minutes together. Go work on that thing now. And so, if they did that for a month, for 31 days, then they got some Chick-fil-A at the end of it. So just trying to encourage these daily good habits. I do want to make one more final sound observation, since this was a COVID sound based discussion. And I had a help from a few colleagues on this. It's that students were just not really playing their horns anymore. They were letting the horns play them. And so we've been kind of establishing this play the horn, don't let it play you kind of mentality. And one of the techniques that I remember picking up a while ago was, if you play the horn on a G, for example, and you remove the mouthpiece, where is that buzz? Are you buzzing in the center of the pitch or not? And so many times, I mean, I'm willing to go out and say 100% of the time, my students, when we came back from the pandemic, were not buzzing on the center of the pitch. They were a minor third above. They were a fourth above. So I'll demonstrate that real fast before we get out of here. And you hear that, daw. I mean, that's going up a fourth, right? We're way too high. And so one of the things that we were encouraging was just the simple fact of buzz that G again on the mouthpiece. So buzz on the mouthpiece and reinsert. And reestablish that core sound, because you're playing so high, and they're hearing from band directors, you're sharp, pull out. It's that mentality that we got all the time, and that's that reversal of that. And then another one that I've been having students do is you push your tuning slide all the way in, you have your tuner up on the stand, and you work to play the Caruso 6 notes, breath, attack, tongue, just like this. Staring that tuner down and really making sure that you are able to center that pitch and play the horn, because this instrument was not meant to be played pulled out this far, right? It's meant to be played in its specifications. I mean, maybe with a little, tinkering here and there. And so that's another thing that we've worked to just really, once you do that in a simple warm up, then you go on to your playing, you pull out, you do your thing a little bit, and you work to open that sound up a lot.
Yeah, we did with the horn something very, very similar. It's a little harder for us to go, put the horn and the mouthpiece back in. A little bit more complicated holding an instrument. But we did a lot of the Caruso method. There are a lot of horn resources, and I utilized a lot of things that were on YouTube. So rather than listening to me, they could listen to some other horn players in really good recording settings and match that sound a little bit more. Julie Landsman was one who does the Caruso method for horn and goes through each step and everything. And obviously lip slurs, all that fun stuff to get back in there as well. So these results are not final yet, but the early returns coming back are really good, honestly, so far. Students are in their practice room more, they're outside, they're with groups, practicing, performing, doing as much as they can. Obviously, we know this is a group effort between students, teachers, ensembles, just everybody. And like we said in the beginning, we're not claiming to be, all powerful, all supreme knowledge on this information. But coming out of the pandemic, or at least somewhat back into normalcy, no one has dealt with this before. And so we thought it was good to have a conversation and to continue the conversation to help facilitate, better learning for students and for teachers, and to support one another in this, manner that we are all in. So we are both available by email for any questions or thoughts that you have, and we would love to hear from you all. You can find our information on this final slide that's being posted. And on behalf of Dr. Hunt and myself, we thank you for watching and listening today.
Yeah, thank you all.
All right. Bye.